Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle a question, kind of a big one that's been around forever but still feels super relevant. Can we or should we even try to separate the art from the artist? You know, like when we find out a creator has beliefs we really disagree with, you sent in some research on musicians who have been accused of putting fascist ideas into their music, and we're going deep on why this whole debate matters so much.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of what artistic freedom means, how much power a symbol can have, even how we each bring our own baggage to the table when we interpret art.
Okay, so before we get into specific musicians,
Sure.
let's get on the same page about what we're even talking about here. Fascism, it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but what's at the core of it? When we say that word, what ideas are we actually dealing with?
At its core, fascism is about extreme nationalism. It's about authoritarianism, the glorification of the state, like the state above everything else. And it often, though not always, involves racism and xenophobia. Those things become tools to unite the in-group against some kind of perceived enemy.
So we're talking about a very specific set of ideas, and dangerous ones at that.
Yeah.
And you're saying these ideas can kind of creep into art in subtle ways, even if it's not as obvious as like swastikas and marching bands.
Exactly. Think of it like a spectrum. On one end, you've got the really blatant symbols and lyrics, right? The stuff that leaves no room for interpretation. But then things get murky when we start talking about aesthetics, themes, even certain musical styles that have historically been linked to fascist movements.
Which brings us to the reason we're having this deep dive. You flagged a couple of artists, Albin Julius of Der Blutharsch and Douglas Pierce of Death in June, both in the neo-folk and industrial scenes, who've really stirred up this controversy. So what's the deal with them?
Well, both of them have been accused of using fascist imagery in their music, though they've denied that they actually believe in the ideology itself. So this raises a really tricky question. Intent versus interpretation. Like, does it even matter what the artist meant to say if the work ends up being perceived as harmful or offensive to people?
Right? It's like, are we just reading too much into things, or are there genuine reasons to be concerned when this kind of imagery pops up in music?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's rarely an easy answer. So let's start with Albin Julius and Der Blutharsch. They were known for incorporating military themes, authoritarian imagery, particularly from Nazi Germany, into their work.
Okay, so already we're in potentially dicey territory. I mean, militaristic aesthetics, those aren't unique to fascism, right? But using Nazi-era stuff specifically, that seems like a pretty deliberate choice.
Exactly. And this is where context becomes really important. Julius always denied actually being a fascist, saying it was more about artistic provocation, exploring the darker side of history. But he was also kind of vague about the whole thing, and that combined with the fact that he collaborated with other artists who have been linked to far-right groups, well, it fueled the controversy even more.
So it's almost like he was playing with fire, right? And whether he meant to start a forest fire or not, the potential for harm is there, and we, the listeners, are kind of left trying to figure out if this is a fire we even want to stand near.
That's a powerful way to put it, and it really highlights how much responsibility we have as consumers of art, especially when we're talking about potentially harmful ideologies. We can't just passively consume this stuff. We have to engage critically with it.
Which leads us to Douglas Pierce and Death in June, another group that has generated a lot of debate and controversy. What kind of imagery were they using that raised red flags?
Well, similar to De Blutharsch, Death in June used a lot of symbols and aesthetics that were drawn from fascist regimes, most notably the Totenkopf, that death's head symbol that's closely associated with the SS in Nazi Germany.
Okay, yeah, now we're talking about some seriously loaded imagery. I mean, the SS is, for a lot of people, practically synonymous with the horrors of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So how did Pierce explain using something like that in his music?
Pierce, just like Julius, denied endorsing fascism outright. He claimed his use of these symbols was meant to be provocative, to challenge taboos, that he was reclaiming them from history and stripping them of their power. But critics argued that no matter what his intent was, using such powerful, triggering imagery, it risks normalizing, maybe even glorifying, the very ideologies that those symbols represent.
And it doesn't help that Pierce was also known for being, shall we say, strategically vague when people asked him about his beliefs directly. It's almost like he enjoyed the controversy a little too much.
You're right. That evasiveness, that kind of leaning into ambiguity, it just fueled the speculation even more. It made it harder for people to give him the benefit of the doubt. And then, like Julius, Pierce also had collaborations with artists who had shall we say, questionable ties to far-right groups. So that just muddied the waters even more.
Like he was daring you to accuse him of something, but then refusing to actually have an honest conversation about
Yeah.
it. Pretty frustrating.
Yeah, and that's a pattern we see over and over in these kinds of debates, unfortunately. It really shows how hard it can be to separate the art from the artist, and their social circles. But let's bring another band into the mix here, Throbbing Gristle, who also used shocking imagery but were perceived very differently.
Oh, this is where things get really interesting. Throbbing Gristle. They're considered the godfathers of industrial music, right? They were known for really pushing boundaries. But I don't associate them with fascism in the same way as the other bands we've talked about. So what made them different?
You got it. Throbbing Gristle, they dove into some really dark, taboo subjects. Yeah, they used provocative images, harsh sounds, all that. But their whole approach was different. It was anti-establishment, like they were more interested in picking apart power structures, systems of control, rather than aligning themselves with any one ideology.
So context is key. Again, it's not just about the imagery itself, it's how it's used, what it's supposed to mean in the bigger picture of the artist's whole body of work.
Right, exactly. And with Throbbing Gristle, what came across was this critical, subversive intent, like their song Discipline. They use military rhythms, those harsh sounds we talked about, but then the lyrics, they're all about dissecting how social control works, right? Which is something fascist. They exploit that. They don't critique it.
And didn't Throbbing Gristle also really engage with their audience in a way that Julius or Pierce didn't really do?
They did. They didn't shy away from dialogue. They saw their music as social commentary, not just like shock value for the sake of it. They wanted people to talk about it, to debate these things. And that helped clarify what their intent was. It made for a more critical listening environment. They even started their own record label, Industrial Records, as a way to challenge norms, artistic and social.
So it seems like transparency, being willing to have that open dialogue, that's one way to tell the difference maybe between artists who are flirting with these dangerous ideologies versus those who are really trying to critique power in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's a really important distinction to make because, let's be real, listening to art that even comes close to this stuff, to fascism, even if you're doing it critically, it's emotionally heavy.
No kidding. It's not like putting on some happy pop music in the background. So knowing what we know now, knowing how easy it is to get things wrong, how should we be approaching this kind of music responsibly? Should we even try?
That's the big question, right? It's like a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
We can't just shy away from difficult art, but we can't pretend there's no risk in letting ourselves be influenced by bad ideas.
Okay, so no easy answers. But where do we start? Give us some guidance here.
I'd say informed engagement is key, like understanding the history of fascism, how it actually works, the tactics it uses, even how it can worm its way into music and art. That's essential. Think of it like if you're worried about counterfeit money, you gotta know what the real deal looks and feels like to spot a fake writing.
So educate ourselves.
Yeah.
Not just about the music, but the whole historical and ideological context surrounding it.
Exactly. Then you can start asking some critical questions as you listen. What kind of imagery is being used here? What themes are they using? Why do I think this artist might be drawn to this stuff in the first place? Do I feel uncomfortable? And if so, why?
Those are some heavy questions to ask just because you're listening to music. But I get it. It's about being an active participant, not just letting whatever sounds cool wash over you.
Yes. And don't be afraid to dig a little deeper. Read the lyrics. See what the artist says in interviews, if they've addressed any of this directly. Context is everything.
Like being a detective, almost. Looking for clues, trying to figure out the bigger picture. But what about when those clues lead to more questions than answers?
Then it's time for some of those uncomfortable conversations. Talk to friends, read critiques of the music, even look for opinions that are totally different from your own, The more perspectives you can get, the better equipped you'll be to actually form your own opinion, an informed one.
And it's okay if that opinion is just, this makes me uncomfortable, I don't want to listen anymore.
Absolutely. You get to choose what you engage with. This isn't about making everyone an expert in, fascism detection. It's about giving listeners the tools to be critical, to listen with discernment, to any kind of music, really.
Because at the end of the day, it's about being responsible consumers of culture, right?
Right.
We can't just passively absorb whatever's thrown at us, especially not when it comes to something as potentially harmful as fascist ideology.
Well said. And that brings up another important point. We've been focusing on individual artists, the choices they make, but this whole issue, it goes way beyond a few controversial figures. We need to look at the bigger picture, the cultural and historical forces that make certain aesthetics, certain ideas appealing to people, even if it's unconscious.
So zoom out a bit. We're not just talking about a few bad apples in music. We're talking about something more pervasive, something about the cultural air we breathe. So what are some of those broader forces at play that we should be aware of?
One big one is this concept of romantic nationalism. It's been used for good and bad throughout history. Basically, it's this idea of idealizing your nation's past, often through myths, symbols, heroic stories, that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that can be really powerful, tapping into those feelings of shared identity,
Yeah.
this longing for a glorious past.
Right. And while that kind of romantic nationalism can inspire really positive social movements, it can also be used for bad, even dangerous purposes.
Yeah.
Fascist regimes, they love to romanticize a mythical past. It lets them justify what they're doing in the present. Like they're just restoring some lost golden age, you see.
And this plays out in music too, right? Like, you have certain genres, subcultures even, that might end up romanticizing historical periods or aesthetics that have, shall we say, problematic connections to fascism.
Exactly. And that's where those critical thinking skills become so important. We need to be able to step back and say, okay, is this romantic nationalism being used to glorify the past in a way that, I don't know, whitewashes the bad parts or promotes exclusionary ideologies?
So being aware of the potential pitfalls, how those seemingly harmless aesthetics can be twisted and used for harmful purposes.
Right. And asking ourselves those tough questions. What is it about this aesthetic, this historical period, that appeals to me? Am I romanticizing something that maybe shouldn't be romanticized?
Once again, it comes back to self-reflection, that critical engagement.
It always does. The goal isn't to create a world where we're like banning art or being afraid to enjoy anything in case
Well,
it has some problematic meaning, right? It's about giving ourselves the tools to be informed, to be discerning.
so we can make conscious choices about the art we support, the ideas we challenge, and yeah, what we choose to walk away from.
Exactly. And hopefully through that whole process, we can create a relationship with art and music that's more nuanced, more informed, and ultimately more responsible, even when it's tough, even uncomfortable.
Which, let's be honest, is often when art is at its most powerful, its most thought-provoking.
Couldn't agree more.
So we're back and ready to keep going on this whole idea of art, responsibility, ideology, all that good stuff. Before we took a break, we were talking about those bigger cultural forces that can make certain looks, certain sounds, certain ideas appealing, even when they're tied to, well, let's be blunt, dangerous things like fascism.
And it's important to keep in mind that these forces, they don't just vanish, right? They change, they adapt, they find new ways to pop up again in our culture.
Especially now, it seems like.
Yeah.
The world's more connected than ever. Ideas spread like wildfire online. It's almost instant. So it feels like there's even more responsibility on each of us to be critical, to think about what we're taking in, whether it's music, news, even just stuff people post on social media.
Absolutely. It's information overload out there. It's so easy to get swept up in a narrative, a good story, without really thinking about if it's true, if it's healthy. And frankly, the people who want to take advantage of that, who want to spread harmful ideologies, well, they're really good at using these tools, these digital tools.
It's like they know how to hack our brains.
Yeah.
Right. Using algorithms, targeted messages, they know how to tap into our fears, our desires that need to belong, all of it.
Exactly. And that's why this conversation, this whole deep dive into art and ideology, it's so important right now. It's bigger than a few bands, bigger than a few symbols. It's about recognizing patterns, seeing the tactics that have always been used to manipulate people, to control them.
Like we're building a mental toolkit,
Yeah.
giving ourselves the skills to spot those red flags,
Yeah.
to hear those dog whistles that might otherwise just slip right past us.
Yes.
Sure.
Because once you start seeing those patterns, those echoes of fascism in the aesthetics, the rhetoric, you start to see them everywhere. And that's both, well, it's a little scary, but it's also empowering.
Because we can't afford to just sit back and passively consume culture anymore.
Right.
We have to participate. We have to question what we see, what we hear, even what we're told to believe.
It's a lifelong process, being this aware, but it's essential. If we want to live in a world where these ideologies, these dangerous ways of thinking, are less likely to take hold.
So what now? Where do we go from here? What can we, each of us, do to be more responsible, to push back against this stuff?
Education, that's always number one. The more you know about history, about propaganda, about how these ideologies actually work, the better equipped you are to recognize them and call them out.
So keep learning, keep digging deeper, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right. And don't be afraid to have those difficult conversations. Talk to your friends, your family, even people online. Challenge each other. Share what you're learning. Build a network of people who are paying attention.
Because at the end of the day, it's on all of us, right? The more we talk about this stuff, the less power those who benefit from our silence will have.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep questioning, keep challenging, keep the conversation going.
Well, we covered a lot today. Specific artists and what they put in their work, these bigger forces shaping our world. It's been intense, but I feel like my eyes are definitely a little more open.
That's the sign of a good deep dive. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about learning to ask the right questions.
And those questions, they don't stop just because the episode's over. So to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep listening critically, and keep those alarm bells ringing. Anytime something feels a little bit off.
Because in a world where truth and lies are constantly fighting for our attention, the most radical thing you can do is think for yourself.
That's a great thought to leave us with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay engaged.